History usually remembers the names of kings and generals. It records the deafening roar of cannons, the clash of cold steel, and the violent tremors of collapsing empires. But how does history record a tragedy that arrives without a single gunshot? How does it measure the weight of an absolute, devastating silence? Tonight, we will not speak of battlefields soaked in blood. We will gently open a different chapter. A chapter where millions of lives slowly faded away, not amidst the chaos of war, but under the quiet, heavy shadow of an impossible dream. Close your eyes for a moment. Let your breathing slow down. Imagine the year is 1958. You are standing in the middle of a vast, endless plain in rural China. The evening air is crisp and carries the faint, familiar scent of damp earth and burning rice straw. In the distance, the silhouettes of humble mud brick houses blend into the darkening horizon. A gentle, cool breeze brushes against your skin, making the golden stalks of wheat sway in a rhythmic, hypnotic dance. The sky above is a canvas of deep twilight blue, dotted with the first pale stars of the evening. It is a peaceful scene, a scene that has repeated itself for thousands of years in the heart of this ancient land. But beneath this tranquil surface, a massive, invisible tide is beginning to swell. The entire nation is holding its breath, intoxicated by a grand illusion, standing on the precipice of an era that will change everything. Now, pull your blanket up to your shoulders. Make sure it is warm and comforting. Let the tension melt away from your muscles. Let go of the worries of today. Allow my voice to be your guide as we drift back in time, over 60 years ago, into the quiet villages of a bygone era. Listen to the wind of history. Let it carry you into a deep, peaceful sleep. The story begins not with malice, but with a burning, desperate desire, a desire to awaken a sleeping giant. The leaders of the era looked across the oceans and saw the towering smokestacks of foreign powers. They felt the heavy burden of a nation left behind by the relentless march of industrialization. And so, a monumental decree was born. The Great Leap Forward. It was a promise to condense centuries of progress into a mere 15 years. To turn a poor agrarian society into a gleaming utopia of steel and boundless harvest. The posters plastered on the peeling walls of every village painted a paradise. They showed giant, smiling farmers holding wheat stalks as thick as young trees. They depicted pumpkins so massive they had to be carried by a horse-drawn cart, and the people believed it. They wanted to believe it. After decades of war and suffering, the promise of a golden age was too sweet to resist. The air in the villages was electric, with a strange, feverish hope. Gongs and drums echoed through the valleys from dawn until dusk. Millions of peasants, men, women, and children marched into the fields with red flags fluttering in the wind. They worked under the scorching sun, and they worked under the pale moonlight, driven by a collective trance. They planted seeds closer and closer together, believing that the sheer force of their will could conquer the ancient laws of nature. They called them Sputnik fields, hoping the crops would shoot into the sky just like the rockets exploring the cosmos. From a distance, it looked like a beautiful symphony of human resilience. The official reports began to flow into the capital, carrying astronomical numbers. Yields were said to have doubled, tripled, then multiplied by 10. The granaries were reported to be overflowing, bursting at the seams with grain. A triumphant euphoria swept across the land. The dream, it seemed, was finally becoming a reality. The ancient cycle of famine and hardship was supposedly broken forever. But nature, in its profound and silent wisdom, cannot be rushed. It cannot be dictated by slogans or paper declarations. The earth has its own rhythm, a slow, deliberate heartbeat that ignores the impatient demands of men. The seeds planted too closely together began to suffocate. The soil, exhausted and pushed beyond its limits, silently wept. The grand illusion was a magnificent castle built on a foundation of dry, crumbling sand. The higher the towers of promises reached into the sky, the deeper the hidden cracks grew beneath the surface. Imagine the texture of that soil slipping through the calloused fingers of an old farmer. For generations, his ancestors knew the exact distance to plant each seed. They knew the language of the wind and the signs of the changing seasons, but now that ancient wisdom was replaced by the rigid instructions of a new era. He stands there in the fading twilight, looking at the overly crowded shoots of wheat. They are thin, they are fragile. They are competing desperately for the same drops of water, the same sliver of sunlight. He feels a quiet ache in his chest, a subtle premonition that he dare not speak aloud. The village square is alive with the crackle of a loudspeaker, broadcasting triumphant marches and poetic praises of the record-breaking harvests. The sound echoes against the mud walls, drowning out the gentle, natural sounds of the evening. The children run around with paper lanterns, their faces glowing with innocent joy, unaware of the fragile thread their future hangs upon. The older folks sit on wooden benches, puffing on their pipes, the sweet smoke mingling with the cool night air. They nod along to the broadcasts, letting themselves be carried away by the collective dream. It is a moment of profound irony. The peak of hope, just a millimeter away from the abyss. The illusion of absolute control over the earth was so intoxicating that it blinded an entire nation to the subtle, silent warnings of the natural world. The land was being drained of its life force, not by drought or flood, but by human ambition pushed to the absolute extreme. The rivers still flowed, the moon still rose, but the delicate balance of existence had been irrevocably shattered. The celebrations continued into the night, the red lanterns casting warm, flickering shadows on the ground. It was a picture of absolute prosperity. While the radios broadcasted endless songs of a miraculous harvest, a quiet, invisible frost was already settling over the roots in the dark fields, waiting for the sun to rise. When the sun finally rose, it did not illuminate a land of plenty. Instead, it revealed a landscape slowly descending into a bizarre and tragic fever dream. The fields, once the beating heart of the villages, were increasingly abandoned. The golden wheat, which should have been carefully tended to, was left to overripen and wither in the wind. The farmers had a new, urgent mission, a mission that was supposed to catapult them into the modern age. Across the vast plains, in every backyard, courtyard, and village square, thousands of small, primitive structures began to sprout like strange, earthen mushrooms. These were the backyard furnaces. Imagine the heat radiating from these crude clay ovens. In the dead of night, the countryside was no longer dark and peaceful. It was dotted with millions of flickering, orange glows, resembling a sky filled with fallen burning stars. Men, women, and even the elderly gathered around these fires, their faces illuminated by the intense, crackling heat. They were told that to become strong, the nation needed steel, rivers of steel. And so they fed the hungry mouths of the furnaces with everything they had. They chopped down ancient forests, stripping the mountains bare to keep the fires burning. They threw in their wooden doors, their wooden beds, and the roofs over their heads. But a furnace needs more than just wood. It needs metal to melt. Listen to the metallic clatter echoing through the narrow village alleys, the sound of desperation, disguised as progress. They brought their cast iron cooking pots. They brought their farming tools, the very hoes and plows that had sustained their ancestors for generations. They dismantled the iron gates of old temples. They pulled the nails from their walls and the locks from their doors. Everything was sacrificed to the roaring flames. They watched, hypnotized by the fire, as their livelihoods melted into glowing, shapeless puddles. They believed they were forging the backbone of a new empire. But in reality, when the fires died down and the ash cooled in the morning mist, what remained was not industrial steel. It was brittle, useless pig iron, a fragile monument to a colossal illusion. They had traded their ability to grow and cook food for worthless lumps of dark metal. While the earth was being scorched by the furnaces, the skies above were not spared from the grand delusion. A new directive swept across the land like a sudden, violent storm. The natural world was categorized, judged, and condemned. The sparrow, a small, unassuming creature, was declared an enemy of the harvest. It was accused of stealing the grain that rightfully belonged to the people, and so began a war unlike any other in history. a war waged by millions of humans against the tiny birds of the air. Picture the sheer, deafening noise. At a coordinated moment, entire villages and cities erupted in a cacophony of sound. People rushed into the streets, into the fields, and onto the rooftops. They banged on tin wash basins with wooden sticks. They clashed cymbals, beat massive drums, and shouted at the top of their lungs. Children waved long bamboo poles with red rags tied to the ends, running through the courtyards to prevent any bird from finding rest. The air was thick with the dust of stomping feet and the relentless, mechanical roaring of the crowd. Up in the pale sky, the sparrows flew in desperate, panicked circles. They sought refuge in the branches of the remaining trees, but the deafening noise chased them away. They tried to land on the eaves of the houses, but the frantic waving of the flags forced them back into the air. Hour after hour, the relentless assault continued. The birds, with their tiny, fragile hearts beating wildly, simply could not land. Their wings grew heavy, their energy drained away into the cold currents of the wind. And then, slowly, silently, they began to fall. Like dark, tragic raindrops, the exhausted bodies of the sparrows plummeted to the earth, lifeless before they even hit the ground. The people cheered, collecting the small bodies in massive piles, celebrating a triumphant victory over nature. They thought they had conquered the skies, but by removing the sparrows, they unlocked the gates for a true, devouring army. Nature is a delicate, intricate web, woven with the threads of balance. When you violently rip one thread away, the entire structure begins to unravel. The sparrows did eat a small amount of grain, but they also ate the insects. Without the birds to keep them in check, a dark, ominous cloud gathered on the horizon, the locusts. They arrived not with a loud declaration, but with a low, menacing hum that vibrated through the very soil. Millions upon millions of jaws descended upon the vulnerable, overcrowded crops. They chewed through the stalks. They devoured the leaves. They stripped the land of its green vitality. The farmers, exhausted from tending the furnaces and chasing the birds, could only watch in silent horror as their promised utopia was eaten alive. Yet, as the fields turned barren and the reality of the disaster set in, a different kind of plague was spreading through the halls of power, the plague of fear and ambition. The local officials, caught in a terrifying bureaucratic maze, dared not speak the truth. To admit failure was to admit treason against the grand dream. And so, they chose the illusion. They sat at their wooden desks, under the dim light of oil lamps, and they forged the ledgers. They dipped their brushes in black ink and wrote down numbers of staggering, impossible abundance. They reported that the granaries were overflowing, that the harvest had exceeded all expectations. These pieces of paper, carrying the weight of massive lies, traveled up the chain of command, painting a picture of a nation drowning in prosperity. But back in the villages, the truth was stark and hollow. The state, believing the inflated reports, demanded its share of the harvest. The quotas were impossibly high. To meet them, the officials sent armed men to confiscate every last grain from the peasants. They swept through the mud houses, searching beneath the floorboards, digging into the hidden corners of the kitchens. They took the seeds meant for the next planting season. They took the meager rations meant to carry the families through the harsh winter. The granaries of the state were locked tight with heavy iron padlocks, guarding the confiscated food, while the people who grew it were left with absolutely nothing. A heavy, suffocating silence began to descend upon the countryside. The gongs and drums of the campaigns faded away into distant memories. The fiery glow of the backyard furnaces was extinguished, leaving behind only cold grey ash. The borders of the villages were quietly sealed. Militia men stood guard at the crossroads, preventing anyone from leaving to beg for food in the cities. The peasants were trapped in a vast, invisible prison of their own making. The grand illusion had finally collapsed, and the true, devastating cost was about to be paid in the currency of human lives. The winter was coming, and it was bringing a darkness that no furnace could ever warm. The winter of 1959 arrived, not with a sudden storm, but with a creeping, paralyzing frost that slowly drained the color from the world. The sky turned into a perpetual, heavy canvas of ash grey. The once golden plains, where the grand illusion of the Sputnik fields had been planted, were now buried under a thick, unforgiving blanket of snow. But the most terrifying aspect of this winter was not the biting cold. It was the silence. Listen closely to the memory of that village. Can you hear the barking of dogs? No. Can you hear the gentle clucking of hens or the heavy, rhythmic breathing of water buffaloes resting in their pens? No. All the animals, the faithful companions of the agrarian life, had long since vanished. They were either surrendered to the communal kitchens during the peak of the frenzy, or quietly consumed when the first pangs of true hunger began to bite. The village, which had been deafeningly loud just months before with the clanging of gongs and the roaring of backyard furnaces, was now trapped in an absolute, suffocating stillness. It was a silence so profound that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the mud roofs. Inside the small, dimly lit houses, families huddled together on their brick beds. The kangs, which were now cold. There was no more wood to burn. It had all been sacrificed to the iron gods of the furnaces. They wrapped themselves in layers of worn cotton and tattered blankets, trying to preserve whatever little body heat remained. They spoke only in hushed, fragile whispers, because even the act of raising one's voice required energy they could no longer afford to waste. When the hidden stashes of grain under the floorboards were finally swept clean, the desperate search for sustenance moved outward, into the frozen, barren landscape. Imagine the hollow crunch of footsteps on the icy snow as a father walks into the woods. He does not carry a plow or an axe. He carries a small, rusted knife. The people turn to the wild grasses first, boiling weeds into a thin, bitter broth. When the snow buried the grass, they turned to the trees. Picture the ancient elm trees surrounding the village. For centuries, they had provided shade in the summer and a windbreak in the winter. Now, they were systematically stripped bare. You could hear the faint, scraping sound of fingernails and dull blades peeling the rough bark from the trunks. The trees stood naked and shivering in the wind, white and scarred, mirroring the skeletal figures of the humans who fed upon them. The bark was boiled, pounded into a coarse paste, and swallowed. It offered no nutrition, only a temporary, agonizing illusion to trick the empty stomach. When the bark was gone, they dug through the frozen earth with their bare, bleeding hands to find roots, chewing on the tough, fibrous wood, just to feel something between their teeth. And then, when the organic world had nothing left to give, humanity was forced to cross a dark, unimaginable threshold. They began to eat the earth itself. If you are listening to this in the dark, imagine a silence so heavy it swallows the wind itself. No cries, no footsteps, just the waiting. No, they sought out a specific type of soil, known as Guanyin soil or kaolin clay. It was a dense, white clay, usually used for making porcelain. Imagine the texture of this cold, chalky earth on the tongue. In their profound desperation, mothers would mix this white mud with water, forming it into small, heavy cakes, and bake them over a meager fire of dried weeds. They fed these clay cakes to their children. The clay tasted like dust and despair. It filled the empty voids in their stomachs, stopping the excruciating cramps of hunger. It provided a false, fleeting sense of fullness. But the human body cannot digest the earth. The clay hardened inside them, becoming a solid, unmoving mass. It pulled them down like a heavy iron anchor, dropped into a dark ocean. The bellies of the children swelled tightly, distended and hard to the touch, while their limbs grew as thin as fragile twigs. The very earth that they had worshipped, the earth that had failed to yield its crops, was now slowly, silently turning them to stone from the inside out. How do we comprehend such suffering? As we look back through the lens of history, we must cast aside all judgment. The moral boundaries that civilization took thousands of years to build the concepts of right and wrong, of dignity and shame, are incredibly fragile. They are a luxury that evaporates instantly in the face of absolute starvation. The primal, overwhelming instinct to simply exist, to take one more breath, overrides everything else. And We do not judge the ghosts of that winter. We simply observe them with a heart full of sorrow and a profound, quiet compassion. We bear witness to the unbearable lightness of the human body when the spirit is trapped in a decaying, starving vessel. Yet, history is often written in the ink of bitter contrasts. While millions of spectral figures wandered aimlessly through the white, silent villages, searching the frozen mud for a single overlooked seed, a vastly different reality was unfolding, hundreds of miles away. In the grand halls of the capital, beneath the glowing chandeliers and high, vaulted ceilings, the air was warm and smelled of roasted meats and sweet wine. State banquets were being held. Crystal glasses clinked in toasts to the glorious successes of the Great Leap Forward. Orchestras played triumphant, swelling melodies that echoed against the marble walls. The architects of the grand illusion sat around polished wooden tables, smoking expensive cigarettes, looking at large maps and beautifully forged ledgers filled with astronomical, imaginary numbers. They were entirely insulated, separated by an impenetrable wall of bureaucracy and fear from the agonizing reality of the countryside. A chasm of tragic proportions had opened up, swallowing the truth. The leaders dreamed of a utopian future in the warm light, while the people who were supposed to build that future were quietly, slowly freezing to death in the dark. In the summer of 1959, far away from the desolate plains, high up in the cool, misty peaks of Mount Lushan, a gathering took place. It was a conference of the highest architects of the state, surrounded by ancient pine trees and serene clouds. For a brief, agonizing moment, a single ray of truth threatened to pierce through the thick, suffocating veil of the grand illusion. A letter was written. A voice of dissent was raised by a veteran general who had traveled back to his home province and witnessed the silent horror unfolding in the villages. He spoke of the empty fields, the useless backyard furnaces, and the wind that carried the unmistakable scent of mass starvation. He held up a mirror to the utopian dream, reflecting the skeletal reality of the countryside. It was a pivotal crossroad in history, a moment where the immense suffering could have been acknowledged, where the tragic march toward the abyss could have been halted. The nation held its breath. The fate of millions hung delicately in the balance of a single room. But the mirror was violently shattered. To admit such a colossal error was perceived as a fatal blow to the very foundation of the era's authority. The voice of truth was swiftly condemned, labeled as treason, and permanently silenced. The conference, which could have been a desperate rescue mission, transformed into the final, sealing decree of the tragedy. The policies were not reversed. They were doubled down. The quotas were enforced with an even tighter, more unforgiving grip. The illusion was protected at all costs, and the last, fragile window of hope for the rural population was quietly, firmly shut. They were abandoned to the darkest winter of the 20th century. Walk with me now, slowly, into the deepest, coldest part of the year, 1960. We are going to descend to the very bottom of the abyss, not to judge, but to bear witness to a silence that the world must never forget. Step over the threshold of a nameless mud brick house in a forgotten village. The wooden door hangs loosely on a single rusted hinge, swaying slightly in the freezing wind, uttering a low, mournful creak. Inside, the air is stale and carries the heavy, dusty scent of absolute abandonment. The faint light of the moon filters through a torn paper window, illuminating the fine particles of dust dancing in the cold air. Look at the wooden spinning wheel in the corner of the room. It is completely still, draped in thick, grey cobwebs. The clay pots by the cold hearth are shattered, holding nothing but dry earth and dead spiders. On the large brick bed, the kang, there are no blankets left, only a pair of small, worn-out woven straw shoes left neatly by the edge, waiting for a child who will never return to wear them. There is no blood here. There are no bullet holes in the walls. There are no ashes of a sudden, violent destruction. The village simply stopped. It exhaled its final breath and slowly sank into the frozen earth. It is a tragedy, born not of a barren land, but of a barren truth. The soil was fertile, the rivers were full, but the fields had been planted with political lies. And lies, no matter how beautifully they are painted in bright red and gold on propaganda posters, cannot be harvested. They cannot be baked into bread. They can only feed the ego of an empire while starving its very soul. History books often record the toll of this era in cold, rigid numbers: 30 million, perhaps 45 million. The tentaper, when numbers grow that large, they lose their human shape. They become abstract statistics, impossible for the human mind to truly grasp. But tonight, in this quiet darkness, let us try to feel the profound weight of that number. Think of a single human life, the warmth of a mother's hand, the sound of a father's deep, reassuring laughter, the innocent, boundless dreams of a child chasing a paper kite in the spring breeze. Every single one of those 30 million souls was an entire universe of memories, of loves, of fears, and of hopes. Now, imagine plucking one star from the night sky, then another and another, until the entire galaxy is plunged into total, absolute darkness. That is the magnitude of the Great Leap Forward. It was an erasure of cosmic proportions. Day by day, breath by slow, agonizing breath, an entire generation of the rural heartland simply ceased to exist. They faded away into the mist, their names unrecorded, their graves unmarked, swallowed by the vast, silent plains of the yellow earth. Listen to the wind howling through the empty alleys of the ruined village. It carries no anger. It carries no vengeance. It only carries a profound, endless sorrow. A sorrow for the fragility of the human condition, for how easily we can be blinded by our own magnificent ambitions, for how quickly the desire to conquer the heavens can drag us down into the deepest, darkest trenches of despair. Let the silence of the village wash over you. Let it fill the room you are in. Feel the immense, tragic stillness of those years. It is a silence that demands our respect, our contemplation, and our deepest, quietest empathy. Time is a river that never stops flowing. It carries away the ashes of empires, the echoes of grand slogans, and the profound grief of forgotten villages. In the spring of 1962, the sky, which had been locked in a bitter, grey paralysis for years, finally began to soften. Heavy, dark clouds rolled over the plains, not bringing locusts or cold winds, but a gentle, forgiving rain. Listen to the sound of those first raindrops, hitting the dry, cracked yellow earth. They fall slowly at first, then gather into a steady, rhythmic drumming. It is the sound of nature, in its infinite compassion, weeping for the children she had lost and washing away the scars of a devastating illusion. The water seeped deep into the soil, touching the roots that had laid dormant and terrified. The backyard furnaces, those crude monuments of human arrogance, were left abandoned in the rain. Without the fire to sustain them, the clay began to dissolve. Within a few short years, the harsh edges of the furnaces were softened by the wind. Green moss, the quiet conqueror of all human endeavors, began to crawl up the sides of the broken bricks. Wild vines wrapped around the rusted remnants of the iron pots that could not be melted. The earth was reclaiming its own. Nature does not hold a grudge. It simply waits for the fever of human ambition to break, and then, with absolute patience, it heals the wounds we inflict upon it. In the vast tapestry of Buddhist philosophy, there is a concept known as avidya, which translates to profound ignorance or delusion. The Great Leap Forward was not merely a political failure, it was the ultimate manifestation of avidya. It was the tragic delusion that man, with his fragile tools and fleeting lifespan, could command the eternal forces of the cosmos, that he could order the birds to fall from the sky, dictate the growth of the grain, and forge a paradise out of iron and fear. But impermanence is the only true law of the universe. Every empire that believes it will last 1,000 years eventually crumbles into the very dust it tried to control. Every grand ambition, no matter how fiercely it burns, eventually flickers out, leaving nothing but cold ash to be scattered by the wind. The millions of souls who wandered those frozen plains did not perish in vain if we can learn to sit with their silence. Their story is a profound reminder of our own fragility. It teaches us the virtue of humility before the vast, unknowable forces of nature. We are not the masters of this earth. We are merely its transient guests, walking softly upon a surface that has absorbed the tears and triumphs of countless generations before us. Now, take a deep, slow breath. Let the cool, damp air of that healing spring rain fill your lungs. And as you exhale, I want you to look at your own life in the reflection of this vast, historical mirror. What are the burdens you are carrying tonight? What are the anxieties that keep you awake in the dark? The deadlines, the conflicts, the pursuit of success, the fear of falling behind. When placed against the infinite canvas of history, against the silent endurance of those who weathered the darkest winters, our daily struggles begin to lose their sharp, painful edges. The worries of today are just tiny ripples on the surface of a deep, ancient ocean. They are fleeting. They are impermanent. 100 years from now, the emails you did not answer, the arguments you did not win, and the wealth you did not accumulate will all dissolve into the quiet hum of the universe, just like the smoke from the backyard furnaces. So, give yourself permission to let go. You do not need to conquer the world tonight. You do not need to force the harvest. You only need to rest. Let the heavy armor of your daily responsibilities fall to the floor. Let the silence of the past wrap around you like a thick, warm blanket. Imagine those endless plains of rural China as they are today. The golden wheat has returned, swaying peacefully under the silvery light of a full moon. The wind whispers gently through the tall stalks, singing a timeless, soothing lullaby. It is a song of peace, a song of forgiveness, watching over the sleeping souls of the past and watching over you. The earth has healed, and so too will your mind. If this journey through the quiet corridors of history has brought you a moment of peace, a moment of reflection, please consider leaving a gentle subscription to this channel. It helps us keep the lantern lit for our next journey. But for now, close your eyes completely. Surrender to the comforting darkness. May your mind be as calm as a forgotten village in the spring rain. Good night, and we will meet again in another distant memory tomorrow.